Good evening, everyone. Tonight, our metropolitan area and the whole world mourns the death of 43-year-old movie actress Natalie Wood. Miss Wood won the hearts and minds of fans of the silver screen everywhere.
All right, so where are we?
We are at Two Harbors, Catalina Island. This is near the area where Natalie Wood drowned.
All right, so we walked out to the beach here in Isthmus Cove. Doug's Harbor Reef was down there. And we're just taking a look at the cove here and the moorings. So the Splendour was out there when it wasn't at Avalon, which is that way around. And again, that's Blue Cavern Point, and in between there, just off that point is where she was found.
So I was really excited to take this voyage because I've been fascinated by the Natalie Wood story since I was a little girl. My husband may have even been a little bit more excited about this trip than I was through the years because I've talked about it so much. He's become so interested in it that he may even be a little bit more of a Natalie Wood enthusiast at this point than I am, which is saying something.
Honey, have you seen my Natalie Wood book?
But we were both super excited to take this trip, really interested to see Catalina Island. If you haven't been to Catalina Island, it is really absolutely beautiful. If you take the ferry out, it's about a 2-hour boat ride to the Two Harbors part of Catalina. You will go first past Avalon, which is much more touristy. There's a lot more to do, restaurants, stores. That tends to be probably where most of the people on the ferry are going to get off, just because it's got a lot more to do and it's more populated. Two Harbors side is more remote. There's a little bit less to do. I kind of liked that peaceful quality. It also had a very haunting quality. When we were trying to put this video together, it was a little bit challenging because in recent years, there has been so much revised interest in Natalie Wood's death and the circumstances around her death that there really wasn't anything that hadn't been said already. There are a lot of really great YouTubers who have made really, really good videos about this that contain probably all the key information. And I didn't particularly feel like there was much benefit in being redundant. I didn't know that we really had anything new to bring to the table, other than giving people the opportunity to see the real places, including Doug's Harbor Reef, the restaurant where they had eaten that night, the area where the boat was moored, things like that. I did think that there was value in sharing that. After giving it some more thought, it really occurred to me that there is an interesting story kind of buried in the events that led to the case being reopened in 2011. Exactly 30 years after the event took place, Natalie Wood drowned on November 29th, 1981. The case was reopened on November 29th, 2011. That in and of itself is very rare and unusual. And as somebody who had really been fascinated by the case and followed it through the years, I was very surprised when this case was reopened. This was something that had gotten a lot of attention, obviously, at the time, and through the years there were articles about, speculation about, but it had pretty much dwindled down. By this point, I don't think anybody saw this coming. I think it was a huge shock. It sort of came down to what I would almost call the dueling Natalie Wood biographies. So we saw this sort of play out in a series of books that were written about Natalie in the years leading up to the reopening of the case. I started thinking about this when I was doing the research for the previous video we did on Albert Goldman's Elvis biography. It really kind of made me remember fondly the time when books were influential. I'm going to put some links for some really great videos about the circumstances of Natalie Wood's death, the investigation, biographical information on Natalie Wood and her relationship with Robert Wagner. But I'm not going to revisit that so much here just because there are already so many other great videos that go into detail about that. At the time of Natalie Wood's death, there was initially some speculation about foul play, tabloid, sensationalistic type stories that covered some of the suspicious aspects of the story. But I think by and large, that had died down within a few years after her death. People assumed by this point that this truly was a tragic accident. And I can say for myself, having followed the story, when I was young and I first read about that aspect, there was something a little bit intriguing about the idea that this had been more than an accident. But as I got older and I reconsidered it, I had really come to kind of accept the idea that this really was an accident. And the things that we were hearing at one point about possible foul play or suspicious circumstances were really more probably just sensationalistic tabloid fodder. This changed in 2001 when the author Suzanne Finstad wrote her book Natasha, a biography of Natalie Wood. If you're interested in this story and you've never read this book, it is a really, really, really comprehensive and insightful read about Natalie Wood. Suzanne Finstad, I think, really did the research and created the narrative that informs people's understanding of Natalie Wood, particularly her very enmeshed relationship with her mother and the impact that that had on her life. That is a really fascinating aspect of her life to read about. And she went into a lot more detail about the history of Natalie Wood and Robert Wagner as a couple. And as you're reading it, you don't really know that you're sort of careening to her shocker of an ending, which was the research that she had done into the circumstances of Natalie's death. And she says that when she started this book, she did not think that there was anything suspicious or unusual. She had not started this book intending to prove or disprove anything about the circumstances of Natalie's death. She was more interested in writing about her life. However, when she came to this part of the story, she found some things that were very suspicious to her and very surprising to her because they hadn't been common knowledge to this point. A little bit about Suzanne Finstad. She has written several other celebrity biographies. She's also a lawyer, and so I think that with her legal training and her background as a lawyer, she probably was a little bit more tuned in to certain things about the circumstances of Natalie's death when she was going through police reports and records from that time. And she noticed some things that really stood out to her. So she was the first person to really bring a lot of this information to the public, and she did it in a pretty compelling way, which got a lot of attention, I think, and started to change the perceptions that people had about what had happened. Some of the things that she really honed in on in her research, how insufficient the initial police investigation had been at the time. The lead detective, whose name was Detective Frazier, conducted his questioning of Robert Wagner in about a 5-minute time span. She talked to Detective Frazier herself, and she really had the impression from talking to him that he was very starstruck by Robert Wagner, and that this maybe had compromised how thoroughly he had investigated things. He had also sort of come to, I think, some pretty case closed, cut and dried, it's pretty clear what happened here conclusions just based off of things that Robert Wagner said without really questioning them further or looking deeper. And I think when we look at celebrity deaths, that sometimes there's a little bit of a cult of mystery around, suspicion, conspiracy theories, things like that. Some quick ones that come to mind for me would be Marilyn Monroe's death, the Kurt Cobain. These were situations where the police came in and looked around, made a pretty clear-cut decision of, okay, it's pretty clear what happened here, without really asking a lot of questions or further investigating. So when we go back and look at that, because these investigations were conducted in a somewhat rushed and not comprehensive way, some might say sloppy, it leaves some loose ends where I think it's easy for people to go back and insert conspiracy theories. Now, quite the opposite, I think it's largely accepted that Robert Wagner did play a hand in Natalie's death. I think most armchair detectives have a pretty clear idea of what happened based off of the information that we now know. So what Suzanne Finstad was really looking at in her book was what she considered to be a very deficient police investigation. Evidence and details that had been ignored, things that didn't add up, stories that were contradicted through the years, as well as some revelations that she received from Lana Wood, Natalie's sister, some information that she had received through a series of phone calls from Dennis Davern through the years. Dennis Davern is really the figure in the story that everything hinges on. How culpable you ultimately feel Robert Wagner may have been for Natalie's death is going to largely depend on how credible you find Dennis Davern. I can say from having watched a number of interviews with him and read a lot of quotes from him through the years and read his book, that I think that he made himself of dubious credibility. Through the years, he gave snippets and bits and pieces of the story to tabloids and the National Enquirer. He did some tabloid TV shows. And in all of these, he would tell somewhat contradictory accounts. He'd really be tantalizing and tease readers and viewers with the idea that there was more to share, that he planned to publish in a book one day. A lot of people felt that he was just somebody who was exploiting, having been involved in the lives of celebrities and having been present during the time of Natalie Wood's drowning. He did appear somewhat shady. However, I will also say that having listened to a lot of what he has to say, I just kind of believe Dennis Davern. I understand that there are reasons why he's not the most credible person, but I've come to really just get, you just get a gut feeling about things sometimes. And mine about Dennis Davern is that I do believe he's telling the truth. I don't think he's always made the best decisions regarding his involvement in this story, but I do believe that he was truly impacted and haunted by what happened. I don't know that he's ever going to really tell us everything that he knows. I still get the sense he's holding out on some things, but by and large, I do think that what he is telling us is largely credible, and I just find him kind of believable. I can't really even put my finger on why, I just do. On the other hand, I also really want to like Robert Wagner, and I don't want this to be true about him either. Dennis Davern first met Natalie and RJ in 1975. He had a history with the boat, the Splendour, that predated his employment with them. And to get into his role a little bit, he's identified as different things depending on what source you're reading. Sometimes he's the captain, sometimes he's referred to as the skipper, sometimes the caretaker of the boat. I'm just going to call him the captain because when I talk about his history working for the Wood Wagners, I'm going to primarily pull from the book he wrote with his friend Marty Ruley, which is called Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendour. In this book, he refers to himself as the captain of the boat. So that's the language I'll be using. It's a little bit different depending on the source. There is an interview with Robert Wagner where he's asked about Davern. And Robert Wagner says in a very condescending way, oh, he wasn't the captain. He was the caretaker. So, I don't know, semantics. He had first become associated with the boat that was later christened the Splendour in Florida, and he hooked up with an entrepreneur who was basically flipping boats and then taking them to the West Coast where he could sell them at a higher price point. And so he had hired Davern to be part of the crew that was working on this boat. And Dennis Davern sailed from Florida to California in the Splendour. At that point, when it reached California, it was eventually purchased by Natalie Wood and RJ Wagner. At that time, Dennis Davern was still being paid to work on the boat. They came to look at the boat, they met him, they had a conversation with him, they liked him, everybody kind of hit it off. So they decided to hire him as their captain. He worked for them for 6 years between 1975 and Natalie Wood's death in 1981. He lived on the boat year-round and took care of it for them. He was somebody they entrusted with their boat. When you read about them and their marriage and their life at that time, you really get the impression that the time that they spent in Catalina on the Splendour was sort of their intimate family time. It was time that was very sacred to them. I think that it was time that they very much enjoyed and just allowed themselves to be kind of free and relaxed in. I think Dennis Davern, being an employee of the boat who was present for them during those times, he did really kind of see them at their best in some ways. He talks a lot about his relationship with Natalie and how spending time with her when she was vacationing with her family in a place that she loved and felt relaxed in, they kind of fell into some casual conversations. He would talk to her about some of the problems he was having with his girlfriend, things like that. She'd give advice. So I think that they did develop a pretty easy rapport with one another. He seems to have been in awe of both Natalie and RJ during the time of his employment. So Suzanne Finstad, when she was doing the research for her book, learned from Lana Wood beginning in 1992. Dennis Davern called her. He had found her number at work. She described some very intense phone calls with him where he was heavily intoxicated and told her that he needed to get off his chest what had really happened the night of 1981. He talked about being haunted by it. He talked about feeling damaged by it. He talked about really feeling like he needed to unload this and share with her what had really happened to her sister. What he told her was that he had seen Natalie and RJ arguing on the deck of the boat. They had had a very, very intense argument regarding her relationship with Christopher Walken. This then was taken back to their stateroom. He described this argument as violent. He'd never seen them in this state before. They were both enraged with each other, yelling, things were being thrown around. He got scared. He made him very uncomfortable to see his employer behaving this way, and he did not know what to do. He did come and knock on their door, ask if everything was okay. The door was answered by Robert Wagner. The lowering rage told him to go away. At that point, he went to the bridge of the boat and began playing music loudly so that he could drown out their voices. So what Dennis Davern originally told Lana Wood, according to what Lana Wood told Suzanne Finstad, was that not only did he hear them arguing and physically see them arguing on deck, but that he also saw RJ shove Natalie and Natalie go off the boat. He was trying to convince RJ that they needed to go in the water to rescue her, but RJ told him, you know what, we're going to teach her a lesson, we're going to wait a minute, we're not going to jump in right away. And eventually Natalie's screams went silent. Now, Dennis Davern has later refuted this. This is not the official story that he told the authorities. It's not the official story he sticks to now. Suzanne Finstad says that during a conversation with Davern, where she questioned him about why he was changing his story, he intimated to her that he was afraid that if he told the real story, he himself could end up in jail, or Robert Wagner could end up in jail. He also told her at one point, this was before he had published his own book, that he didn't necessarily want to go on the record with some of these things because he had plans to publish his own book. So I do want to make it very clear that starting with the timeline of about the mid-80s, when Dennis Davern first began to speak to tabloids, he had in mind the idea of writing a book. His book was not published until the year 2009. A pretty significant figure in what helped the book ultimately come to fruition was his friend Marty Ruley. She was a childhood friend of his. She was the one who ultimately wrote the book, Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendour, with him, based off of what she knew and what he had told her about the circumstances of Natalie Wood's death. Marty Ruley was involved in this pretty early on. One of the most damning things about Dennis Davern is some footage that was caught backstage in, I believe, the early 90s for a Geraldo Rivera show called Now It Can Be Told. Dennis Davern was appearing as a guest to sort of share these new details about what he had to offer about what had happened the night that Natalie Wood died. Marty Ruley came with him. And they didn't know it, but they were being filmed backstage at one point. And during this conversation, Marty Ruley is trying to convince Dennis Davern that they need to talk about the push on TV. And Dennis is reticent to do this. He just says, no, it's too much. We can't do this. And then Marty kind of backtracks a little bit and says, you're right. We need to save this for our book and then we'll make billions. Marty Ruley has since said that what she said was misunderstood. I'm not sure what her intent there was, but it certainly was suspect looking. And it does let us know that they had an idea about making this into a book for a very long time before it actually happened. A few years after Suzanne Finstad wrote her book, a second biography on Natalie Wood called Natalie Wood, A Life by Gavin Lambert. Gavin Lambert was a longtime friend of Natalie's. He was also a longtime friend of Robert Wagner's. And if you read this book, there's a certain point where it starts to really lose credibility as a biography and begins to come across much more as a very transparent propaganda piece for Robert Wagner. I believe that this book was written to sort of refute the Suzanne Finstad book. And it's interesting. When you first start reading it, it's an interesting book. This was somebody who had a lot of stories about her, who was sort of sharing his experiences with her and had some insights. And that part of it is pretty interesting until you get to the piece where Robert Wagner enters the story. And at this point, it just sort of changes tone. He's really trying to give a very romanticized version of Robert Wagner. And this really continues leading up to the time of Natalie Wood's death. Another thing that I found very disappointing about this book is that for somebody who claimed to be a very close, intimate friend of Natalie's and claimed to want to be writing this book because he wanted to share the life story of his friend, he really starts to take a somewhat questionable tone about Natalie. He becomes very negative about her behavior and sort of the emotional state that she was in the time leading up to her death. He describes her as becoming increasingly difficult, being abusive of alcohol. He describes her as provoking arguments with R.J. Wagner. He also definitely implies that if Natalie wasn't having an affair with Christopher Walken, she wanted to. And furthermore, she was sort of flaunting this in front of R.J. and saying unkind things to him, taunting him a little bit with her attraction to Christopher Walken. Became very negative about R.J. One of the things that Gavin Lambert really purports at this point in the book is that at this time in her life, Natalie was interested in reviving her film career. She had become fixated on the idea of being a serious actress. Christopher Walken at that time, being fresh off of The Deer Hunter and having just won an Academy Award, really represented to her kind of the classic New York serious actor. Natalie, you know, became very like enamored by this and would gush about Christopher Walken and his artistic integrity and what a great actor he was and how much she wanted to be that type of actor herself. And Christopher Walken seemed to be encouraging this in her. They really bonded over this. So this book implies that she really began to taunt Robert Wagner about his career, called him a hack, implied that she was embarrassed by him. And I almost got the impression at this point in the book that Robert Wagner himself had written the book. And there is something to that, because Gavin Lambert was a very close friend of Robert Wagner's. It becomes very apparent at some point that he is a bit of a mouthpiece for Robert Wagner, and that the true intent of this book is not really to celebrate Natalie's life or share her story, but to refute some of the claims in the Finstad biography. This comes out in a couple of different places. He's very, very negative, and I would say downright petty about Lana Wood. He definitely seems to be speaking for RJ in these sections. He just says some really mean-spirited things about her. I believe that this had to do with trying to discredit her because she had shared this information about Dennis Davern that made Robert Wagner look very, very guilty. He also gives the impression that, I'm trying to think of how to say this delicately, there's a really icky undercurrent to the writing where in his attempts to really paint Natalie as having become increasingly difficult and increasingly antagonizing toward Robert Wagner, it sort of sends out a message that although Robert Wagner is absolutely 100% innocent, no question, if he did do it, he had his reasons. At this point in reading the book, I just really started to find this very transparent and distasteful. Interestingly, Suzanne Finstad later claimed that Gavin Lambert was paid by Robert Wagner to write this book, and that he privately complained to her that he didn't really want to do this. He felt pressured by Robert Wagner to do it. And I think that shows in the book itself. I mean, it's not a book of a lot of substance. It almost seems like he was just sort of going through the motions until he gets to the parts that are clearly there to be a Valentine for Robert Wagner. It didn't appear to be enough for Robert Wagner because several years later he wrote his own autobiography called Pieces of My Heart, where he revisits the circumstances of Natalie Wood's death and shares his version of events. What's interesting about this is that, of course, he maintains his innocence. Of course, he maintains that this was an accident and that he doesn't know anything about how Natalie ended up overboard, other than his speculation about the banging dinghy theory. But interestingly, he does reveal some things that contradict what he had originally told the authorities. For example, he had told the authorities that the wine bottle had broken from rough seas. But in his own autobiography, he admits that he and Christopher Walken had had an argument that night, that he smashed the wine bottle in anger. And he's a little bit more revelatory about some of the feelings he had about Natalie's closeness with Christopher Walken. So he does share some things that he hadn't shared before, and he does downright contradict himself. But that's, that's about it. Other than that, it's pretty much the stock answers, the stock explanation of what happened. And you don't really get much more than that. This was not the end of the Natalie books, though, because in 2009, Dennis Davern and Marty Rulli finally did publish their account. I can say that this book is interesting to read in the fact that it's his first-hand account, or the version of the first-hand account that he was willing to share when he finally went public with what at the time he claimed was everything he knew about it. Other than that, it is a fairly tedious read. Basically, the way that the book is set up, Marty Rulli, Dennis's friend, writes about the things that Dennis shared with her through the years about what he knew about Natalie's death. She makes it very clear that Dennis Davern was very haunted by this, very traumatized by this for a long time. And she really wants you to know that it took him a really, really long time to tell her the whole story. And you feel as if you are experiencing this with her when you read the book. I would say that the revelations from Dennis move at a very glacial pace. But basically the point is, it took him a number of years to finally reveal the whole story to her because he was so traumatized by it, from what she says. And it really doesn't amount to much more than what's pretty much commonly known and accepted as what happened at this point. So this claim that Suzanne Finstad made that at one point Dennis Davern had confessed to Lana Wood that he actually saw RJ push her in the water, this doesn't come up in the book at all. And I don't think that we ever will hear him say that. And, for these reasons, the extent of what he really does know is unknown. It's murky. I really don't know what to make of it. You know, I just know that he's told a lot of different stories through the years. Interestingly, Dennis Davern eventually did have a daughter whom he named Natasha after Natalie. The investigation into Natalie Wood's death was reopened 2 years after Dennis Davern and Marty Woolley published their book, Goodbye Natalie, Goodbye Splendour, in 2011. This had come to be because they had initiated a petition to have the case reopened. Suzanne Finstead shares that when the lead detectives who were working on the case at the time came to talk with her for the first time, they had dog-eared copies of the book Natasha with them, and they told her that they had used her book as pretty much the Bible for their investigation. That's how meticulous they found her research to be. That's how influential the work that she did was on the case being reopened. And that's how much of a blueprint she gave for what might have happened that night. Since it was reopened in 2011, it's never really gone away since that time. It continues to appear in headlines. It continues to appear in news pieces. It continues to generate books and documentaries and interest. And the general tone of the way that it's presented at this point is that I think in the court of public opinion, Robert Wagner has been declared guilty. And I don't think he'll ever escape that perception, no matter how hard he tries. I do believe he has tried. Another piece of what could be looked at as Robert Wagner propaganda was the HBO documentary Natalie Wood, What Remains Behind. This was a project that was spearheaded by Natasha Gregson Wagner, who's Natalie Wood's oldest daughter and Robert Wagner's stepdaughter. Now, I will say in terms of Robert Wagner's relationship with Natasha, although he's not her biological father, and she did have a relationship with her biological father, after Natalie's death, Robert Wagner raised her. When you see them interact in this documentary, it's very clear that the relationship and the bond and the love between them is real. So I don't mean to discredit that or to doubt that. It's very clear that Robert Wagner truly loves Natasha and that she identifies him as her primary father figure. It's also very clear that she very much believes his version of events and is very supportive of him. So I do want to make it clear that I do think the bond between them is real, and I do think that Natasha's trust in Robert Wagner and his version of events is real. But I question the agenda of this project in some ways. In many ways, it is Natasha sharing her mother's life story, sharing her memories of her mother. This aspect of it is very touching, it's very moving, it's obviously very heartfelt, and I do think that it meant a lot for her to be able to make this project. However, the aspects of it that involve her interview with RJ, the version of events that they give, the things that Robert Wagner says, and just the overall timing of this documentary, it does really create the impression that this was once again Robert Wagner trying to look for an opportunity to clear his name, trying to look for an opportunity to take some of the tarnish off of his halo. I think Robert Wagner is a very image-conscious person, and I think it's very important for him that he continue to find opportunities to refute what's been said about him. Robert Wagner is also somebody who is very well liked in Hollywood, which is interesting because he himself, outside of his television fame in the 70s, was never really a huge star. That's a big thing when you watch the videos that go into more detail about his relationship with Natalie, is that there was a lot of professional jealousy between them, allegedly. Robert Wagner was somebody who kind of skirted around and circled the drain a little bit of a big break, but never really quite found it. Whereas Natalie, on the other hand, had a very flourishing career. She's associated with a lot of movies that are now considered to be classics, and her place as a Hollywood icon is much more secure. Interestingly, though, Robert Wagner has had a lot of relationships with people who truly are Hollywood icons, and they all seem to be very fond of him. Bette Davis, Elizabeth Taylor. He claims to have had a long-term relationship with Barbara Stanwyck when he was a young man. He's definitely a well-connected guy, and people speak very highly of him. One thing that is interesting about him is that he, much like Natalie Wood, he's somebody whose career kind of straddled different decades and different phases of Hollywood. He came in the studio system, the glory days of Hollywood, and this is the time that Robert Wagner really pines for. A lot of times when we read about the studio system now and that era of Hollywood, what we hear about is how restrictive this was, how oppressive it was for the stars, how you basically became property of the studio and they controlled who you married, who you dated, what you wore, what you looked like, what you could do, created entire new identities and backstories for you, gave you a new name, worked you like a mule, got you addicted to drugs. I think we all have a little bit of a reverence for the glamour of old Hollywood, the classic celebrities, the classic movie stars, the classic films. But Robert Wagner pines for it, I think, in a somewhat different way. He goes into a lot of detail about this in his book, You Must Remember This, which is basically his Valentine to Hollywood. He really wants you to know that he knew a lot of really famous people, and he's a mover and a shaker. But I think what this book reveals about Robert Wagner is that he really pines for the days of the studio system. He talks about this like it was marvelous, sensational, fabulous, wonderful. These are all words that come up pretty frequently in Robert Wagner's vocabulary. He really seems to romanticize the idea that, oh, the studios were wonderful. They gave you an identity. They told you what to wear. They created a whole image for you. They gave you somebody to be. They made you somebody important. In his book, he laments that we are now in an era where celebrities are shown to be real people, and we see pictures of them in their rumpled sweatsuits at the grocery store. He longs for the days where celebrities were sort of marketed and fabricated to be these sort of larger-than-life icons, untouchable, living lives of glamour and privilege and luxury. I think that there's something about Robert Wagner that really enjoys being a facade. He has a brand and an image, and he never lets his guard down. And I think if you kind of look at the effort that Robert Wagner has put into since 2011, finding what I think are some fairly transparent ways to try to rehabilitate his image, draw people's attention away from the scandal, convince people of his innocence, there's just something about it that really speaks to somebody who really values their image. And when you kind of think about his behavior on the night of November 29th, 1981, according to the stories of Dennis Davern and other people who interacted with him, immediately after they started to make calls for help to look for Natalie and told other people that she was missing, they talk a lot about Robert Wagner being very concerned about not wanting the media to find out, about him explaining that he didn't alert anybody to the fact that his wife was missing until several hours later because he was concerned about their image, the media getting a hold of this, what people would think, wanting to avoid rumor. And, you know, when you really hold that up to the light of day, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. There's something very suspicious about that. And there's something very revelatory about Robert Wagner and what he values. It offers a little bit of a glimpse into why he might have made some of the decisions he did that night. When we look at Robert Wagner's influence and how that might have affected how things unfolded after the death of Natalie Wood, there are a couple things here that are pretty interesting. First of all, they reveal that Robert Wagner is somebody who has a fair amount of pull and influence, but they also show a pretty consistent pattern of behavior. One thing that Suzanne Finstad shares was a letter from Frank Sinatra, who was a very good friend of Robert Wagner's, and had what I would say was a pretty sordid and tawdry history with Natalie. According to a lot of accounts, he had had a relationship with her beginning when she was around 15 or 16 years old, and he was in his late 30s. This was something that is said to have been largely arranged by Natalie's mother, who sort of encouraged Natalie to be alone with Frank Sinatra and develop a relationship with him in order to further her career. What Suzanne Finstad claims is that after Thomas Noguchi, the coroner at the time, he's often sort of referred to as the coroner to the stars. He was also the coroner at the time of Marilyn Monroe's death. In a press conference, he was the first person to reveal certain details that went on to be really key in how we interpret the events of that night now. He was the first person to make public that there had been an argument occurring earlier that night between the three parties, Natalie, Christopher Walken, and Robert Wagner. He also revealed that Natalie had been drinking heavily that night. And he also had started the process of ordering what he called a psychological autopsy. He wanted to find out as much as he could about Natalie's emotional state during the time, from a psychological perspective, what might have been going on in her life. That was new information to the public, so naturally people kind of jumped on this as being scandalous and suspicious, which led to Frank Sinatra immediately writing a letter to the Board of Supervisors, putting pressure on them, admonishing them for this, letting them know that he was not happy with it. And that carried enough weight at the time to get Thomas Noguchi fired. So because of that, the psychological autopsy was called off at this point. The investigation was essentially halted. And a lot of what people consider now to be Thomas Noguchi's very almost nonsensical findings, or things that just don't add up. For example, The types of bruises that Natalie had more likely indicate that Natalie was the victim of an assault that night. Suzanne Finstad also shares that Robert Wagner went to some lengths to discredit her book once it was published. She had a talk show appearance on Larry King that was canceled due to Robert Wagner's friendship with Larry King. She was originally set to be involved in a TV movie version of her book, The Mystery of Natalie Wood, which originally was supposed to follow her narrative and her speculation much more closely than the finished product. At some point in the development of this TV movie, the presentation of Robert Wagner was toned down, made more flattering, and at the end of the movie, the actress who's playing Natalie Wood is shown going out to the boat to untie the dinghy, as per Robert Wagner's speculation. So this was not the book that she had written, and she did not feel comfortable being associated with it, and so she withdrew at some point. And she very, very much believed that the change in the story had to do with Robert Wagner. Lana Wood, interestingly, also accuses Robert Wagner of having had her blacklisted through the years. Following Natalie's death, she had started to work in the production end of show business, not so much in front of the camera anymore, and according to her, had begun to create a career for herself doing this, where she was finding steady work. At some point, she began to realize that opportunities were drying up. She was offered jobs, and then these opportunities were taken away from her, and she didn't really understand what was happening. She was later contacted by a friend of Robert Wagner, who kind of told her, hey, just between you and me off the record, I think it's only fair for you to know this. RJ's having you blacklisted. He's the reason that you're not getting work. You really should just try to pursue a different career path at this point, because I don't think this is going to happen at this point with the influence that he has. So these are a couple things that really give us an idea as to how influential Robert Wagner really was, which is interesting because we don't necessarily think of him as an A-lister or one of the great icons of Hollywood. He's somebody who was around for a long time. He rubbed elbows with a lot of the greats. And he was somebody who managed to kind of survive, having been a second-rate actor during the heyday of Hollywood who never really quite made his mark or found his niche, into later translating that into huge success on television. I believe with Heart to Heart, he really hit his stride. That was work that he was very well suited to. He was very likable and very charismatic in that work and found success there. And I think it was a good fit for him. It's worth noting that his career was really at its all-time high point at the time that Natalie Wood died. And this was probably a time in his career that he had waited a long time to find this level of success. And I don't think he wanted to do anything to compromise it. Personally, I think his best work was as number 2 in the Austin Powers movies, because this was an example of him parodying himself. And so this was an opportunity for him to kind of take his persona and poke fun at it a little bit. He was well suited to it. And I think this was the high watermark of his acting career. While we were exploring the island, we would come across things that had been referenced in the story before, which gave us almost an eerie feeling to encounter these things. For example, when you read about the search for Natalie that night, it's often mentioned that it's a very cavernous area, so there was some speculation that she may have possibly have washed up in one of these caves and be stuck. And as we were walking and we came across some of these caves, it was just very eerie to see this stuff face to face. To really make the connection that this was what was being referenced in a lot of the accounts that we had read of the search that night. The experience of being on Catalina Island was very surreal. After having read about this so often, seeing it in documentaries, hearing about these spots and kind of visualizing an idea of what they looked like based off the descriptions, it was hypnotic to be there. Stepping in Doug's Harbor Reef was almost like stepping back in time. I imagine that it still looks today very much like it did in 1981. We did have lunch at Doug's Harbor Reef, now called Harbor Reef, and it was excellent. Incidentally, Doug of Doug's Harbor Reef fame is the person who actually found Natalie's body. We also were able to see the bar, step inside the restaurant, get a look at its interior. The person who was there that day showed us the captain's table, which they speculated was most likely where their party would have sat that night. This was the spot that was often reserved for celebrities and famous people who were coming in to dine. We don't know for sure that that's where they sat, but being that this was kind of the reserved spot for celebrities, and they were well-known celebrities on the island, it's very likely that they did. So it was very interesting to see that spot face to face. Taking the ferry ride to Catalina almost felt like being on hallowed ground to us. It's very somber and quieting going past Blue Cavern Point and recognizing that this was the area where Natalie was found. We had read about this so many times, we'd seen it in so many documentaries, but being at the actual spot was very sobering. The island itself had that same feel and quality to us. It's a very small area. It was very easy for us to sort of cover all the ground and go to all the spots. We spent a lot of time just kind of sitting and reflecting and drinking in the atmosphere. These spots that we had read about so many times, Doug's Harbor Reef, very interesting to go in there, be in there, see them in person. It has a very ethereal quality, but there was something a little bit haunting about it. After having read so much about these events that happened in the past, there was almost a sense of turning back the clock when we were on the ferry and approaching the island.